This is Alex from VoiceCast. The sun, our source of life, our guiding light, is gone. The world has plunged into darkness, and the only thing colder than the absence of light is the weight of what we've just witnessed. What you're hearing now, this is no ordinary radio broadcast. This is an emergency, a plea for survival. The first thing you notice is the silence. It's unsettling. When the sun went out, you'd expect a sudden frantic chaos. People screaming, panicking, running for shelter. But no, what hit first was a deep, unnatural stillness. The world around you felt like it was holding its breath, collectively frozen in the moment of disbelief. You could almost hear the heartbeat of the planet thumping in your chest, as if the earth was about to tear itself apart. But it didn't. Instead, there was just silence. The kind of silence that speaks volumes. The kind that echoes through your bones and fills you with a cold dread, like a shiver running down your spine that you can't shake. And that was just the beginning. You look up, and it's not what you expected. There's no gentle dimming of the sky, no gradual fading into dusk. The darkness, sudden and sharp, is suffocating. One moment you were enjoying the warmth of sunlight, perhaps going about your daily routine, maybe looking at the sky for a fleeting moment and thinking, what a beautiful day. And then, just like that, it was gone. The sky, once vibrant, now covered by an unyielding shadow, an oppressive blackness that swallowed everything in sight. It wasn't a normal eclipse. It wasn't a cosmic event that would pass in a few minutes, leaving us with an unforgettable sight. Number this was different. This felt wrong. The streets that were once buzzing with activity, filled with people going about their lives, now stood still. People froze in place, looking up at the sky with a mixture of awe, confusion, and deep, deep fear. Some hoped it was just a glitch, an anomaly that would pass. But the minutes ticked by, and the darkness didn't shift. The sun, once a reassuring presence in the sky, wasn't coming back. And then the power went out. One by one, city grids failed. The hum of electricity, once a constant, disappeared. Streetlights blinked, then flickered, and then nothing. Complete blackout. The once steady pulse of modern life, reliant on power, came to an abrupt halt. No lights, no phones, no signals. Just a thick, oppressive blackness. People began looking at each other, their eyes wide with fear, as if waiting for someone else to say it wasn't real. But no one spoke. The realization sank in, heavy and uninviting. The initial reaction from people varied. Some huddled together in fear, trying to make sense of what was happening. Others stood there, paralyzed by the impossible sight before them, unable to comprehend the magnitude of the event. But the question echoed in all of our minds, whether whispered or screamed in silence. What is happening? Power grids across the globe failed in synchrony. The climate began to shift almost immediately. People who were used to the warmth of daylight suddenly felt a chill, creeping in despite it still being daytime, according to their clocks. The temperature dropped rapidly, unnaturally fast. It wasn't just the loss of sunlight. It was the loss of everything that sunlight represented. The life force that kept the planet moving, that dictated the cycles of nature, that provided the warmth for crops, for animals, for humans to exist. The trees, once full of vibrant leaves, stood eerily still, as if holding their breath along with the rest of the world. Animals who had grown accustomed to daylight and the rhythms of the sun became restless. The panic began to spread. It wasn't immediate. No, it was like a slow-moving wave creeping toward every corner of the world. As hours went by and the sun remained hidden, the realization grew sharper. This wasn't some temporary celestial event. This wasn't something that would be over in a few hours. The sun had gone dark, and it wasn't coming back. For the first time in human history, people began to understand what it meant to live without the sun. The very thing that had sustained life on this planet for billions of years, the thing we took for granted, assuming it would always be there, was gone. And the fear wasn't just about the cold or the darkness. It was the realization that the planet, our existence, was being upended in a way no one had ever considered. What happens when the light that sustains us disappears forever? It wasn't just an astronomical event anymore. It was an apocalypse, a darkening that threatened not only our physical survival, but our very sense of purpose. The world had gone dark, and no one knew what would come next. I'm Alex, and you're listening to VoiceCast. What you're hearing right now, the story of the Eclipse apocalypse, the sun going dark, isn't a mere tale. It's our reality. It's the story of how the world changed in an instant, how humanity now faces an uncertain future, and how we survive when everything we once relied on is taken from us. Hold on, survivors. We'll get through this together. As the sun disappeared, so did any sense of normality. What had begun as a rare celestial event quickly spiraled into a cosmic nightmare. At first, the world tried to find answers in science. Surely there was a reasonable explanation, but as the hours ticked by, it became clear that no one had answers. Not the experts, not the astronomers, not the governments. What had caused the sun to dim in such an unnatural, permanent way? In the days leading up to the eclipse, astronomers had noticed unusual solar activity. The sun, normally a steady glowing ball of energy, had been acting strangely. There were bursts of solar flares, unexpected magnetic anomalies, and inexplicable sunspots. But none of these were supposed to be enough to trigger what we're experiencing now. No one predicted this. Even the most seasoned experts were left scrambling for an explanation. Theories swirled in the media, from cosmic interference to the possibility of some unknown force at the edge of the solar system. Some scientists thought it might be an unprecedented solar storm, but they had no data to support it. Others spoke of a black hole or some form of cosmic disturbance, but each theory was as unsupported as the last. Despite their best efforts, there was nothing concrete. As the first few hours of the blackout passed, panic started to set in. The unease people had felt when the darkness first fell quickly transformed into full-blown hysteria. Social media, still somehow operating in patches, became flooded with frantic messages, warning signs, and poorly understood speculations. As if the dimming of the sun wasn't terrifying enough, now the very fabric of society was unraveling. The loss of sunlight was more than just a physical absence. It felt like an existential crisis. People flooded the stores, buying up everything they could get their hands on. Shelves were emptied within hours. Fuel, canned food, flashlights, basic supplies became treasures, and the world turned into a race to hoard whatever was left. It wasn't just the stores that saw chaos. The streets became battlegrounds as people fought for scarce resources. Riots broke out in cities worldwide, from New York to Paris, Tokyo to Sydney. The once thriving markets and public squares were now war zones of desperation. News outlets struggled to keep up with the global chaos, each report more chilling than the last. Governments scrambled to maintain order, but it quickly became clear that they were out of their depth. Military forces were dispatched to control the unrest, but nothing seemed to quell the growing panic. Power outages continued to spread as nuclear plants, already struggling to handle the energy crisis, began to shut down. In the midst of it all, some people tried to keep a semblance of calm. One of those was Emma, a teacher from a small town in Pennsylvania. When the sun vanished, she was in the middle of class, trying to explain basic biology to her students. The moment the lights flickered, her first thought was that the power had gone out. It wasn't unusual. Storms could cause power surges. But then the silence came. The unnatural, suffocating silence that pressed against the classroom walls. Emma glanced out the window. The sky was still dark, too dark. Her heart raced. Something was wrong. She tried to keep her composure, though her voice trembled as she gathered her students around. "Listen, kids," she said, her voice firm, though she could feel the lump in her throat. "We're going to be okay. Stay calm. It's probably just a temporary thing." But even as she spoke, she could hear the panic rising outside. Parents were rushing to pick up their children, unsure if it was safe to leave them in school. One by one, she kept her students calm, offering them reassuring words, even though she had no idea how long this would last or what would happen next. As the day wore on, more and more parents arrived, visibly distressed. Emma watched the confusion and fear on their faces, but what struck her most was how helpless she felt. She wanted to tell them that everything would return to normal soon, but deep down, she knew that wouldn't be the case. Elsewhere, Dr. Thomas Hargrove, a renowned astrophysicist, found himself in a race against time. He had been studying the solar anomalies for years, and when the first signs of trouble appeared, he was one of the first to raise the alarm. He had been on a live interview when the sun first went dark. This is something we've never seen before," he stammered, looking at his colleagues, who seemed equally stunned. "The sun, it's gone, and I can't explain it." Hargrove had tried everything to warn the world. He gave interviews, sent out papers, and tried to get in touch with global leaders. But the world was already spiraling into chaos. His warnings were dismissed by governments who had no answers themselves. "It's just a temporary anomaly," they told him. "Don't spread panic." But the panic spread anyway, and Hargrove's predictions of societal collapse began to come true. The scientists watched in horror as people turned to the only thing that seemed to make sense to them: religion. Places of worship became packed with people looking for salvation, answers, anything to make sense of the world they were now living in. Ministers, priests, and imams spoke words of comfort, but even they couldn't mask the growing fear that lingered in every corner of the earth. Despite the best efforts of some to maintain order, it was clear that humanity was facing something far bigger than any of us could understand, something that no one had the power to stop. The absence of the sun wasn't just an astronomical event. It was a challenge to the very core of human existence. With no answers and no solutions, it was only a matter of time before society would break down entirely. As the day turned to night, or what we now called night, though the sun had never returned, people clung to whatever scraps of normalcy they could find. But even in the darkest of hours, some still held out hope. Some still believed that this was only temporary. But deep down, we all knew. We were witnessing the end of the world as we knew it. With each passing hour, the impact became clearer. The sun, now a faint memory, had taken with it more than just light. It had taken our sense of security, our way of life, and as governments and society scrambled to react, one question lingered in the air, unanswered and terrifying. How long would we last without the sun? I'll keep you updated, dear listeners. Stay with us. There's more to come. As the hours turned into days and the days into weeks, the world began to feel the true weight of the sun's absence. What had initially seemed like a mere inconvenience was now transforming into a global catastrophe. With no sunlight to fuel the Earth's ecosystems, the cascading environmental effects were swift, brutal, and irreversible. The first sign of the planet's decay was the sudden drop in temperature. It didn't happen gradually, as one might expect with a natural eclipse. Instead, it was an abrupt, terrifying plunge into the cold. The air, once warm and breathable, became sharp, biting. The cold was unlike any winter chill. It wasn't the gentle decline of fall into winter, but a savage, relentless freeze that spread across continents with no sign of stopping. In cities, the temperature fell 20 degrees in a matter of hours, then 40 degrees, and within a day it was as if winter had come 10 times over, slamming down the world's population with a freeze that no one was prepared for. People bundled up in layers upon layers, but nothing could keep the cold out. It wasn't the kind of cold you could escape by moving indoors. Entire neighborhoods fell into darkness, not just because of the power outages, but because the cold was so intense it penetrated everything. Homes, offices, schools. It was as if the earth itself had become a tomb. The ecosystem began to unravel almost immediately. Without the sun, crops across the globe started to wither, one field at a time. Fields that once were lush with grains and vegetables now lay barren, their soil frozen solid beneath a thin layer of frost. Farmers who had spent years tending to their crops stood helplessly as their livelihoods died before their eyes. "I've worked this land for decades," said one farmer, his voice barely audible over the sound of howling winds. "The sun has always been my guide. I've seen droughts, I've seen storms, but nothing like this. I don't even know what to do anymore. These crops, they're just turning to ice. There's nothing I can do to save them." Crops, grains, vegetables, fruit, died within days. The very foundation of the food chain began to crumble. As the temperature continued to drop, the once thriving forests of the world started to wither. The tall pines that had stood as sentinels for centuries began to bend under the weight of the snow and ice. Leaves turned black and shriveled. The vibrant greens that once adorned the world had been replaced by a ghostly white, as frost covered everything, turning it into a desolate landscape. Animals, too, couldn't survive in this frozen hellscape. Herbivores, already weakened by the disappearance of their food sources, began to drop dead by the hundreds. Deer, rabbits, and even bears were found frozen in place, unable to find food or shelter. Without plant life to nourish them, the food chain began to collapse in an irreversible cascade. In the oceans, the effects were just as dramatic. The water, which had once been warmed by the sun's rays, began to chill. And it didn't take long for the fish to perish. Coral reefs, which were already under strain from climate change, began to die off in record numbers. The oceans, once teeming with life, turned into vast cold deserts. Without sunlight to sustain the delicate balance of marine life, the seas became graveyards, and then came the storms. The absence of the sun didn't just bring about cold, it brought instability. The Earth's weather systems, thrown off balance by the sudden loss of solar energy, became chaotic. What were once predictable seasonal storms turned into massive, unpredictable weather extremes. Tornadoes and hurricanes spiraled across the globe with terrifying speed. Some areas were ravaged by the kind of storms that used to be seen once in a lifetime, now occurring every few days. Elsewhere, massive ice storms swept across the land. Cities, already crippled by power outages, became more like frozen wastelands. Entire regions were encased in ice, with towering glaciers forming where there used to be roads, fields, and homes. The snow never stopped. It piled up, covering everything in a thick, impenetrable layer. The landscapes began to look like something from a nightmare. Forests, once full of life, now stood as ghostly silhouettes, their limbs laden with ice. Cities, their structures now buried in snow, stood eerily silent. People wandered the streets in search of warmth, but even the most fortified buildings could not protect them from the deepening cold. Once bustling metropolises, now deserted, lay frozen in time, like remnants of some forgotten civilization. The world had become a shadow of itself, a frozen version of Earth, where every living thing struggled to survive. For those who had the misfortune of living through it, survival became a daily struggle against the elements. A family huddled in a small cabin in the mountains, trying desperately to stay warm, as the temperature plummeted to unthinkable lows. Their firewood was running out and the windows were so frosted over that they could no longer see the outside world. The father, once a strong, resilient man, now appeared gaunt and frail, his face marked with exhaustion and worry. His children, huddled under blankets, whispered quietly, too afraid to sleep. "We'll make it through," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. In his eyes, fear had replaced the hope that used to guide him. Outside, the landscape was nothing but ice and snow, the world now hostile and foreign. Elsewhere, a former teacher found herself comforting her students as they stared out the window of their school, watching the snow fall in heavy sheets. It wasn't supposed to be this way. They were supposed to be learning, growing, thriving. Instead, they were simply surviving. The classroom, once filled with chatter and laughter, was now filled with silence. "It's okay," she said, trying to reassure them. "We'll get through this. Just stay close." But even she wasn't sure if that would be enough. As the days dragged on, it became clear that this wasn't just a temporary setback. This was the beginning of a new world, a world where the sun had disappeared and Earth had been cast into an endless winter. The death of the plants, the collapse of the animal kingdom, and the unimaginable weather extremes were only the beginning. How much more could humanity endure before the world became uninhabitable? The great mystery was no longer just the sun. It was whether there was anything left for humanity to cling to. The world had frozen, and with it, our future. The effects of the permanent eclipse were felt not only in nature, but in the very core of human society. In the early hours after the sun's disappearance, there was an overwhelming sense of disbelief, a collective hope that somehow the darkness would lift. Surely this was a temporary anomaly, a strange event, a cosmic glitch, but hope quickly faded, replaced by a cold, creeping dread that something irreversible was happening. And with that realization came the unraveling of everything that had once defined modern life. Without the sun, nothing worked the way it had. Power grids, designed to operate on solar cycles and fueled by natural sources of energy, began to falter almost immediately. Solar panels, once celebrated as the future of sustainable energy, went dark. The sun's light was gone, and so was the power it had provided. Within hours of the eclipse, cities around the world began to go dark. Major metropolitan areas, New York, London, Tokyo, were among the first to lose power. At first, people thought it was a temporary glitch, a hiccup in the system that would resolve itself. They tried to carry on as usual, lighting candles, using backup generators, and gathering around radios. But as the hours stretched into the first night of complete darkness, it became clear that this was no glitch. It was the end of the world as we knew it. People who had once enjoyed uninterrupted power, homes filled with the hum of refrigerators, office buildings alive with the buzz of technology, now found themselves in a world that felt alien, oppressive. The cold seeped in quickly, as there was no longer any way to regulate temperature without power. The cities, normally teeming with life, became vast, empty wastelands, each building a dark monolith, standing sentinel over a silent, uninhabited world. With the failure of power grids came the collapse of entire industries. The most immediate and devastating was agriculture. Crops that had been thriving in the fields just days before withered in a matter of hours, unable to survive without the warmth of the sun. The global food supply chain, once an efficient and well-oiled machine, was reduced to a shambles. Farmers watched in horror as their fields, once green and lush, were now frozen under the weight of the eternal night. Fields of corn, wheat, and vegetables turned brittle and dead, while livestock starved as they wandered aimlessly, searching for food that no longer existed. Without sunlight, plants couldn't photosynthesize, and the food chains that depended on them collapsed like a house of cards. The effect on agriculture rippled through the entire global economy. Prices for food soared into the stratosphere. What little was left rotted in warehouses because there was no power to process or preserve it. Supermarkets, once stocked to the brim, stood empty as entire countries turned inward, hoarding what little food they had. Starvation became a global reality. Nations that had once been powerhouses of food production now found themselves unable to feed their own people. Famine spread across continents. In parts of Africa, Asia, and the Americas, entire populations were left to fight over what little food remained. Industries reliant on solar power, which had been one of the world's fastest growing energy sectors, were among the first to shut down. Solar energy plants, unable to harness sunlight, were rendered obsolete. Those who had invested millions into green energy were suddenly left with nothing. And as the world's industries ground to a halt, so did the global economy. Stock markets crashed. Banks closed their doors. People could no longer access their savings. There was no longer any market to trade in. As the world descended into chaos, governments, too, began to crumble. In the early days of the blackout, there was an effort to maintain some semblance of order. Curfews were imposed. Emergency broadcasts were sent out, urging people to remain calm, to wait for instructions. But as the days wore on, the situation became more dire. With power gone, communication became increasingly difficult. The internet, once the glue that held the world together, was now a distant memory. Social media, the platform for global coordination, was useless. The darkened skies were mirrored by a darker, more oppressive world where isolation reigned. In the absence of clear leadership, fear spread like wildfire. People began to take matters into their own hands. Riots broke out. Looters descended on abandoned stores. Small communities banded together in a desperate attempt to survive. While large cities descended into anarchy, governments, already struggling to maintain control, declared martial law in an effort to curb the violence. Armed soldiers patrolled the streets, trying to suppress the growing unrest. But it wasn't enough. In every corner of the globe, the message was clear. The world had entered a new era, a post-sun society, and no one knew how to survive in it. But it wasn't just the physical collapse of infrastructure that crippled humanity. It was the psychological toll that pushed people to the edge. Fear gripped the hearts of every survivor. People went to bed with the weight of uncertainty pressing on them. Each night there was a primal terror of the unknown. What did it mean for humanity if the sun had gone dark forever? Would the darkness ever lift? Or was this the end? Depression became widespread. For many, the permanent darkness triggered a deep sense of hopelessness. People mourned not just the loss of the sun, but the loss of normalcy, of everything they had once taken for granted. Children who had grown up with the warmth of daylight were now raised in eternal night. The mental strain was too much for some to bear. Suicides increased as people couldn't fathom a life without sunlight. Mass hysteria swept through cities. In the absence of any official answers, people sought comfort in religion, conspiracy theories, and superstitions. Some believed the eclipse was a divine punishment. Others that it was a sign of the apocalypse. People flocked to religious institutions seeking solace, but even the spiritual leaders were left speechless, unable to offer any explanation for what had happened. Fear of the unknown fueled irrational behavior. Survivor perspectives, a store owner witnessing looters. "I never thought I'd see something like this in my lifetime," said John, a store owner in a small town in Pennsylvania. He watched from behind the counter as desperate crowds looted the shelves, taking everything they could get their hands on. It started with a few people, just grabbing necessities, but then it turned into something different. People were fighting, knocking over displays, trampling on others. At first, I tried to stop them. I told them to calm down, that we'd all make it through this. But no one wanted to listen. John's voice shakes as he recalls the moment when he realized that the world he knew was gone forever. I watched my town tear itself apart. People I'd known for years, fighting over cans of beans and bottles of water. It wasn't just about food anymore, it was about survival. And I wasn't sure if anyone was going to make it. For Mia, the darkness came when she was miles away from her family. A student at a college in New York City. She had been at the library when the eclipse occurred. At first, I thought it was a prank. It didn't feel real. The power went out, and people started screaming. But I didn't know how bad it was until I saw the faces around me. No one knew what was happening. They just looked lost. I knew I had to get to my parents, but getting there was another story. Mia's journey through the city was one of chaos and fear. She had to navigate through streets that were becoming increasingly lawless. The streets were full of panic. People fighting over gas, shops being looted, cars abandoned in the middle of the road. I just kept my head down and kept moving, trying to get to my family. But I didn't know if they were even alive. Her journey would take days, with each step filled with uncertainty and dread. I didn't know if I would ever see them again. The fear of the unknown, it eats away at you. It's not just the darkness outside. It's the darkness in your heart. And that's the hardest thing to survive. As society crumbled, the light of humanity, both literal and figurative, was fading, leaving only the chill of eternal night in its wake. The world had plunged into darkness, and with it, humanity had been forced into a new existence. The reality of a sunless world was no longer a theory or a temporary nightmare. It was the new way of life. Survival in perpetual darkness required innovation, resourcefulness, and, most importantly, an unshakable will to live. For those fortunate enough to survive the initial collapse, the struggle had only just begun. The first challenge survivors faced was simple. How do you live without light? The absence of the sun stripped the world of its most basic and essential resource, light. Without sunlight, nothing could grow, no farms could be tended to, and no crops could be harvested. The ecosystem had collapsed, and with it, the infrastructure that had been built on the assumption that the sun would always rise. Artificial light became the lifeline of the new world. Initially, survivors used whatever they could find, flashlights, candles, and battery-powered lamps. But as these resources dwindled, they were forced to think bigger and smarter. Generators, once a backup tool for occasional power outages, became the backbone of survival. They provided not just electricity for lighting, but also for refrigeration, heating, and powering the machinery needed to grow food indoors. The hum of generators became the soundtrack of this new world, but running these generators wasn't without its own set of challenges. Fuel supplies quickly became scarce, and the fight for access to these resources fueled a new wave of chaos in the already crumbling society. For the survivors who managed to secure a safe shelter, the next immediate crisis was food. In the beginning, there were panic buying frenzies, with people stocking up on non-perishable food items, trying to prepare for what they assumed would be a temporary problem. But weeks turned into months, and the realization sank in. There would be no fresh crops, no new harvests, no seasonal cycles. The world's agricultural systems were at a standstill, and the global food supply was collapsing. Yet, where the darkness had taken so much, it also forced human ingenuity to rise. Indoor farming, once a niche practice for the environmentally conscious, became a necessary skill for survival. Controlled environments using artificial lighting, advanced hydroponics, and aquaponics allowed some survivors to grow food. But even that came with limitations. The artificial lights used for these indoor farms were far from perfect, often insufficient to simulate the full spectrum of sunlight required to grow crops efficiently. Still, it was something. It was enough to keep hope alive. In makeshift greenhouses, which were now commonplace in many shelters, survivors grew crops like lettuce, tomatoes, and root vegetables under bright fluorescent lights. These controlled environments didn't just provide food, they also provided a small but vital sense of normalcy. They offered proof that life could still persist, even in a world where the sun had abandoned them. In isolated communities, scientists and engineers worked together, using every bit of knowledge they had to simulate sunlight and recreate the conditions needed to cultivate food. One such scientist, Dr. Eliza Moore, had been researching the potential for artificial sunlight simulation before the eclipse. After the disaster struck, she and a group of volunteers began experimenting with powerful LED lights and controlled temperature environments to find a way to mimic sunlight. It wasn't perfect. Nothing could replace the sun entirely, but they began to see small successes. Their first batch of artificial sun-grown tomatoes were a victory, a sign that maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward in this dark new world. Survival was not just about food and light. The cold, the ever-present chill that crept into every corner of the world was just as deadly. In the absence of the sun, global temperatures had dropped drastically. Once warm homes became cold, desolate places. In some regions, the cold had reached such extremes that entire cities were covered in layers of ice, turning familiar landscapes into frozen wastelands. The bitter cold forced survivors to be resourceful in their efforts to keep warm. The search for shelter had become a primary concern. Those who had access to underground bunkers, basements, or other insulated structures were fortunate. For others, the race to find a safe, warm place had become a matter of life and death. The lack of sunlight meant no more natural heating, and the cold seeped into every building, making even the simplest of tasks feel like monumental struggles. But with the freezing temperatures came a new, terrifying threat: looters. In the chaos of the societal collapse, people who had nothing left were driven to desperate measures. Stores were ransacked. Homes were broken into. In the absence of law enforcement, it was every person for themselves. Some survivors fortified their homes, building makeshift barricades and securing their shelters with whatever they could find: old furniture, wooden planks, or even pieces of broken metal. They knew that in the dark, it was easy to get lost, or worse, to become prey to those willing to take extreme measures for survival. In the city of what was once Chicago, a group of survivors gathered in a community center they had converted into a shelter. There, they built walls from old shipping containers and lined the floors with thick layers of insulation. With the help of a few skilled engineers, they rigged up an improvised heating system powered by their last few remaining generators. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep the cold at bay. They grew their food indoors, relying on artificial lighting to simulate sunlight for their crops. And though their lives were far from easy, they held on to a fragile but undeniable hope. They were surviving. In the midst of all the despair, there were moments of hope. Small victories that reminded survivors that they weren't completely defeated by the darkness. These glimmers of optimism came in many forms, but perhaps the most profound were the communities that formed in the shadows of this global catastrophe. One such community was built around an old warehouse in what had once been a busy industrial district. A diverse group of survivors, farmers, engineers, doctors, and regular citizens had found each other and come together to create a self-sustaining refuge. They pooled their knowledge, their skills, and their limited resources to build a small but resilient society. It wasn't just about survival. It was about rebuilding. They were determined to show that humanity's greatest strength lay in its ability to adapt, even when everything they knew had been taken from them. A young woman, Sarah, who had lost both her parents in the early days of the eclipse, had become a leader in this small community. Despite her own grief and fear, she was a beacon of hope to those around her. She organized efforts to grow food, to secure supplies, and most importantly, to keep morale high. There were days when they thought they might not make it, when the darkness felt all-consuming, when the cold seemed to freeze not just the world, but their will to continue. But Sarah never gave up, and because of her determination, that community had survived. Another shining example of hope came from Dr. Eliza Moore and her team of researchers. Despite the overwhelming odds stacked against them, they continued their work to find ways to simulate sunlight and grow crops in the absence of the sun. Every small breakthrough, whether it was a more efficient LED system or a new method of farming in the dark, was celebrated like a victory, like a sign that they might one day find a way to restore life to the world. Though no one had any illusions that they could fully replace the sun, they believed that through their efforts, they could save humanity from total extinction. The fight for survival in a world without sunlight was far from over, but for those who remained, the struggle was a testament to the strength of the human spirit. Even in the face of perpetual darkness, they had found a way to survive, to adapt, and to rebuild. And while the future remained uncertain, there was one thing they knew for sure. They were not ready to give up. The initial shock of the eclipse had given way to a grim realization. This darkness, this eternal night, wasn't just a celestial oddity. It was an apocalypse. The world was crumbling under its weight, and no one knew how to stop it. But as the weeks stretched into months, something remarkable began to happen. Amidst the cold and despair, humanity's spirit, though battered, refused to break. People didn't just accept the darkness. They fought back. Desperation bred innovation, and from that dark void came flickers of hope. The race to restore sunlight or find a way to replace it began almost immediately. The scientific community, once divided by petty disagreements, now united with a singular goal: survival. Laboratories and universities around the world became hubs of frantic activity as researchers and engineers worked around the clock, trying to devise a solution that could undo or at least mitigate the catastrophic effects of the solar eclipse. For some, the answer seemed obvious. If we couldn't bring the sun back, we could simulate it. Projects to create artificial sunlight became an obsession. Some scientists worked on large-scale systems of mirrors and lenses to redirect sunlight from space, while others explored the potential of synthetic sun lamps to replace the real thing. Yet these solutions weren't without their problems. Solar-powered satellites were launched with high hopes, only to crash and burn in the harsh, unpredictable environment. And attempts to generate artificial sunlight on Earth led to catastrophic failures, with a few disastrous experiments resulting in massive fires and explosions. But in the midst of this chaos, one scientist, Dr. Elena Fisher, stood out, an astrophysicist with a background in solar energy. She was among the first to propose a bold idea: igniting a nuclear fire in space to simulate the sun's heat and light. It was a dangerous, risky proposal, one that had many experts shaking their heads in disbelief. But for Dr. Fisher, there was no other choice. The peoples were starving, the crops were withering, and every day in darkness seemed to push humanity closer to the edge of extinction. She gathered a team of engineers and physicists, and together they began work on a prototype of the most ambitious project the world had ever seen. Project Solarium. As the days of darkness stretched on, the immediate problem wasn't just the cold and the darkness. It was survival. With agriculture crippled and supply chains in ruins, the need for essential resources became critical. Survivor groups, often formed out of necessity rather than choice, began organizing dangerous missions to find food, water, and other necessities. These groups were made up of ordinary people, farmers, soldiers, teachers, and engineers who had once led normal lives, but now found themselves thrust into the role of scavengers. They set out in caravans of makeshift vehicles, armed with whatever weapons they could find, to navigate the treacherous, desolate world outside. The journeys were perilous, filled with unpredictable weather, hostile groups of looters, and the constant threat of freezing to death. One such group, led by a former mechanic named Sam Carter, embarked on a mission to secure a supply of medicine from a hospital in what was once a bustling city. The city, now a ghost town, was surrounded by thick snowdrifts and abandoned buildings, but rumors had spread of untouched supplies hidden in the hospital's underground storage. For Sam and his team, the mission was a matter of life or death. Without those supplies, the sickness that had begun to spread among the survivors would surely take more lives than the cold ever could, but the city was dangerous. A rival group of survivors had claimed it as their territory, and those who ventured into it never returned. Yet Sam and his crew pressed on. They knew that their chances of survival depended on securing resources. They made their way into the heart of the city, battling their way through the snow and frigid winds. But as they neared the hospital, they encountered a gruesome sight. Half the survivors in the rival group had turned on each other in the struggle for food, and what had been a once thriving population was now a scene of lawlessness and decay. Still, Sam and his crew pressed on, and against all odds, they secured the medicine. Their victory was a small one in the face of an overwhelming darkness, but it was enough to give hope to those they returned to. Meanwhile, governments, in their desperation, were willing to take risks they never would have considered in the past. With no sun, no crops, no economy to support them, entire nations descended into chaos. People took to the streets, looting stores for food, shelter, and warmth. Governments imposed martial law, but the riots, protests, and breakdowns in civil order were too widespread to control. But even as governments struggled to maintain order, they didn't give up on trying to restore sunlight. Some took a more extreme approach. The U.S. government, in particular, invested heavily in a project to launch satellites equipped with massive reflective mirrors aimed at bouncing sunlight from the edge of space down to Earth. It was a long shot, a gamble with colossal costs and uncertain results. But there were few other options left. The satellite launch, dubbed Project Helios, was one of the most ambitious and expensive endeavors ever undertaken by any nation. The mission was launched with great fanfare, but the outcome wasn't as expected. The mirrors, too far from Earth, failed to generate enough energy to make any meaningful impact. The frustration of the world's governments mounted as their attempts to restore the sun failed one after the other. In another audacious attempt to provide warmth, the Russian government explored igniting nuclear fires in the atmosphere. It was a drastic and risky plan, one that could lead to catastrophic consequences if it went wrong. But they reasoned that even a temporary burst of heat could save millions. Scientists and engineers worked tirelessly to design a system capable of safely launching a nuclear fireball into the stratosphere to burn and warm the atmosphere. But in the final testing phase, the project encountered an unexpected complication. The blast created such an unstable feedback loop that it threatened to escalate into a global disaster, forcing the world's governments to halt the project. Despite the staggering failure of these experiments, humanity continued to fight back. It wasn't just the scientists or the governments. Ordinary people, too, were risking everything for the sake of survival. One such act of bravery occurred when Dr. Elena Fisher herself volunteered to lead an experimental mission to launch a smaller-scale nuclear fusion reactor into orbit, hoping it could simulate sunlight. The risks were enormous, and the mission was a one-way trip. If the reactor malfunctioned, it could spell the end for humanity. But Elena, driven by the knowledge that the future of civilization depended on success, pressed forward. Her team had only one chance, and they were all willing to make the ultimate sacrifice. In the meantime, Survivors across the world continued to fight for their families and communities. Some traveled across dangerous territories to find rumored safe zones, places where the darkness had yet to take hold, or where resources were abundant enough to sustain life for a few more weeks or months. One young woman, Sarah, embarked on a perilous journey across a snow-covered wasteland to find her family, who had been separated from her during the chaos of the initial eclipse. As she walked through the biting cold, she encountered many who had already given up, families who had succumbed to the darkness, their homes abandoned. As the last flickers of hope dim and the shadows grow deeper, one question remains. Can humanity bring back the light, or will we remain forever lost in the dark? The battle for survival continues, but whether humanity will find a way to reverse the eclipse, or whether we are doomed to live in a world of eternal night, is a question that may never be answered. The struggle is far from over, and the darkness, like the night itself, shows no signs of retreating. Yet the spark of human will refuses to die. As long as there are those willing to risk everything, there will always be a chance. But in this endless void of night, even hope itself becomes a fragile and distant thing. The light may be gone for now, but it's not over yet. The days of despair, of ceaseless darkness and frozen winds were beginning to feel like distant memories. Or perhaps they weren't distant enough. The world had not returned to normal. There was no more normal. The sun had vanished without a trace, and the earth had plunged into a state of perpetual night. But humanity, ever resilient, was learning to live in this new world, to rebuild, to adapt. It had taken months, perhaps even longer, for survivors to even begin to comprehend how to rebuild their lives in this new, sunless reality. Those who survived the initial collapse found themselves in a world so vastly different from the one they once knew. Gone were the green fields and sun-kissed skies, replaced by stark, frozen landscapes and dim artificial light. Cities, once buzzing with the sounds of human life, had been reduced to cold, echoing shells of their former selves. But even in the darkness, humanity was starting to piece together a new existence. Communities began to form around the few remaining sources of energy: solar generators, wind turbines, and hydroelectric plants. Without sunlight, the energy needed to sustain life came from these artificial systems. Though the earth no longer provided, human ingenuity did. Survival now depended on technological advancements and close-knit communities that could pool resources, share knowledge, and find ways to adapt. But rebuilding didn't mean just restoring the infrastructure that had once kept civilization thriving. It meant building new systems. People created underground farms with artificial lights, growing crops in controlled environments. Some built massive greenhouses, a shining testament to humanity's ability to grow life even without the sun. Others worked on perfecting methods for recycling water and harnessing geothermal energy to keep their homes warm in the chilling cold. It was a world where nothing came easily. Every day was a battle against the elements, and every survival tactic had to be reimagined for a planet without light. Yet, no amount of technological advancement could mask the psychological scars left by the eclipse apocalypse. It wasn't just the freezing cold, the endless darkness, or the lack of resources. It was the constant weight of isolation, the unnerving realization that the sun, the very source of all life, was gone. The darkness wasn't just outside. It was inside, too. It had burrowed into the minds of those who had lived through the collapse, leaving them with deep psychological wounds that would never heal. The loss of the sun was a loss of more than just light. It was a loss of hope, of the sense of safety that the day had once provided. There were those who had lived through the apocalypse but couldn't escape the darkness in their minds. Anxiety, depression, and fear became common companions in this new world. The sun had given the world rhythm, Days and nights that marked the passage of time, seasons that signaled growth and renewal. Now, time was fractured. Everything felt stagnant. The human mind, long adapted to the predictable cycle of light and dark, had struggled to find a new rhythm in a world where every day felt the same. But even amidst the overwhelming sadness and fear, the apocalypse had brought lessons. The first, and perhaps the most crucial, was that humanity could survive even the most unimaginable disaster. The human spirit, despite everything, proved itself to be more durable than anyone had expected. In the face of permanent darkness, humanity didn't give up. We adapted. We found ways to grow food in artificial light. We learned to rely on technology, not as a crutch, but as a lifeline. We rebuilt our communities with a renewed sense of purpose, drawing strength from each other in ways we hadn't before. Perhaps the greatest lesson was one of humility. The eclipse had shattered our illusions of control over nature. We had once believed that we could manipulate the earth to our will. We had built civilizations and economies on the premise that the sun would rise every day without fail. But the eclipse had humbled us. We were reminded that we are not masters of this world. We are merely a part of it, subject to forces far greater than ourselves. As survivors began to rebuild their lives, they did so with a newfound reverence for the world around them. Gone was the arrogance of old. In its place was a quiet respect, an understanding that life, any life, was fragile and precious. As months turned into years, the world began to change again, not in the way people had hoped. There was no return of the sun, no miraculous solution to the darkness. But there was something else, a glimmer of hope. Communities flourished in their own way, with people growing accustomed to the new rhythms of their world. Life in eternal night was not easy, but it was no longer unbearable. Survivors no longer lived in fear of the unknown. They had learned to live with it, and yet, even in this new world, there remained a question that no one could answer. In the midst of all the advancements, all the technological miracles, the psychological resilience, there was always a lingering thought: the light. The one thing that had sustained humanity for so long was still absent. Would it ever return? Could it? In the absence of the sun, humanity found its own light. It was not the same as before, not the bright, warm sunlight that had once graced the earth, but it was light nonetheless. Born from the strength of human will, the bonds between survivors, and the ingenuity that had allowed them to rebuild. People found new ways to live, new ways to thrive, even in the absence of the warmth they had once known. But as they ventured forward into this dark new world, one question remained, an unspoken thought that lingered in the hearts of all who had survived. Will we ever see the sun rise again? The stars that now filled the sky were beautiful, yes, but they were cold. They were distant. And they were no substitute for the sun. As the survivors look up at the vast expanse above them, they understand that their fight is not over. In the quiet hum of generators, in the faint glow of artificial lights, they find the strength to carry on. But the memory of the sun, of the light they had lost, will never fade. In their hearts, they hold on to the hope that one day, somehow, the sun will return. And if not, well, humanity had learned something even more important. We could survive the dark, but could we ever truly live without the light? As the last flickers of hope dim and the shadows grow deeper, one question remains: can humanity bring back the light, or will we remain forever lost in the dark?